I would say that at the core of the core of everything we do here at Notre Dame is the belief that an encounter with Jesus changes lives. Like, if I didn't believe that at my core, that I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be a priest. That having an encounter with Jesus changes lives. The problem is, as Pope Benedict once said, when he was Pope, he said, a dangerous phenomena has arisen in our time. He says now in the 21st century, it's kind of just in the air we breathe. This dangerous phenomenon is that we can gradually come to believe that God has no impact on my life, that he can't communicate with me, he can't reveal himself to me, that my life can't change. And he says because of that, we end up living our lives as what he calls practical atheists. We say we believe in God, may even come to church and say words, we'll say the creed, but gradually we can come to believe, because of this dangerous phenomenon in the air we breathe, is that the mindset is that it can all, or that it's really all irrelevant to my daily life, that it's not practical. Which is why an encounter with Jesus is everything. It's so important. So that gradual slip doesn't happen. And we've been hearing that word encounter with Jesus a little bit more recently. Our popes have been talking about it more. We've been talking about it here more at Notre Dame. We see it now when we walk in our vision statement to offer a life-changing encounter with Jesus so that all might be rescued and have abundant life. To encounter Jesus. But it can kind of be abstract, that phrase, encounter Jesus. Like, what does it mean? Or the question is, like, how does it happen? Or the question is, has it happened for me? Can be the question. Because abstract's not helpful. Which is, lucky for us, we have a narrative today of an encounter between a man Zacchaeus and Jesus. And this encounter we see, Zacchaeus' life is turned around. And so for us today, when we look at this, an encounter that might be had today, for us, that Jesus wants for us, but a number of things have got to happen. We see this in this narrative here, and a lot of things happen in this narrative. We just want to look at two. We have to allow ourselves to be seen, and we have to come down. So first we have to allow ourselves to be seen. Zacchaeus, this man in this narrative here, he's a man that does not want to be seen. He stands before us here as a broken man. The things that he's done in his past, or the things that even he's doing, he is a man who is dripping with shame. And if you're dripping with shame, the last thing in the world you want is to be seen. So he's used to just covering up, of hiding more and more of himself. The account says that he's short. He's hidden behind the scene, or behind the crowds. You even think of Adam and Eve, right? They were created in communion with God, but because of sin, they hide. In shame, they hide themselves from one another, and they hide themselves from God. And none of us are immune to shame. None of us in this church are immune to shame, because we've all been wounded by sin. So on different levels, we know what it's like to hide parts of ourselves, to hide parts of our hearts, and to keep them in. This is Zacchaeus. But what we see in a moment of grace, he has this desire to see Jesus. He's heard about him. So in this moment of grace, what we see is he seeks Jesus, and the text says he ran ahead and climbed up a tree. And in climbing up the tree, what it is Zacchaeus, he allows himself to be seen. He's vulnerable. Climbing up a tree, like when was the last time you saw a middle-aged man up in a tree? You don't see it. Here's this this vulnerable act that he makes to say, here I am, I want to be seen. And he opens himself, he exposes himself, and he allows for the opportunity for an encounter because he's vulnerable. One of the most viewed TED Talks of all times, I think it's number 2 of all the TED Talks ever, is by Dr. Brené Brown. She's a professor out of Houston. I'm not sure if she still teaches there because her work has exploded over the last number of years. The books now that she's published, again, traveling around because of this TED Talk all over the country. Dr. Brené Brown, what she's devoted her life to is studying human connection and how, so she shows that neurologically we're wired for connection. Every human is, and that is a desire to belong, a desire to be known, and to be loved. And what she's found in her tens of thousands of people she's met with and talked with and the studies she's done, she's discovered the power of vulnerability. And through the years of research, she says that the way we get connection, the way we get a sense of belonging, the way we get a sense of being known and of love, the sense of having a deep encounter with somebody, is through vulnerability. But she says the problem with that is that you have to allow people to see who you really are. And the problem with that, she says, is that so many of us are ashamed on who we really are. And so the distinction between guilt and shame here is important. Guilt is about behavior. So guilt, when we have guilt, it is, I made a mistake. Whereas shame, it's not about a behavior, it's about self. So rather than shame isn't I made a mistake, shame is I am a mistake. And she says that shame drives our fear of being vulnerable. It keeps us from being vulnerable. And so it's like, if people see me, if they really knew and they saw who I really am, then what happened was that I would hide deeper and deeper, or I would work harder and harder of numbing the vulnerability, which leads to this spot of emotional isolation. And when we live in a spot of emotional isolation, it's not a fun spot to live. And so we even take any relationship with a spouse or a deep friendship. If I tell someone the inner depth of myself, I let them see it. I share it with them. I share the deepest secrets of myself with them, and they truly see me and they still accept me. That's when a relationship really is formed, and a bond and a deep intimacy can happen. And the same is the case with God. Because God's love is not a general love. God's love is a personal love. And the only way for us to have this deep encounter with Jesus is for us to allow ourselves to be seen by him. It's to open up and to be vulnerable with him. And I find that for most people, this is incredibly difficult to do. It's difficult for me to do at times. I meet with a spiritual director once a month, and at times he says, Mark, you're not being vulnerable enough with Jesus. You're in that spot where you're in this emotional isolation. And it's reminder again for this deep to be vulnerable with him. But I think we can almost be conditioned to do that with cancel culture. It's like, I might get canceled. God might cancel me. And here, I even think of, there's a young woman who came to see me once, and she was struggling with a particular sin, and she was struggling with it for quite some time. And so this cycle of sin persisted in her life. And with that cycle of sin that persisted, she lived in this perpetual spot of just beating herself up. And it led to her, as she's perpetually beating herself up, she was in this mindset that she wasn't loved by God, that he had rejected her. And I remember she looked at me once and she says, Father Mark, I know that God has grown tired of me. Or in other words, I have stopped letting myself be seen. I'm not vulnerable anymore with him. I'm not letting him see inside. And that's not good. That's not good for any relationship. It's not good for a spouse. It's not good for a deep friendship when we're not letting the person in and sharing vulnerably. And it's not good for our relationship with God. So the question for you and I this morning is, are we up in the tree this morning? Are we allowing ourselves to be seen by him? Am I coming to him consistently, vulnerably, relating to him vulnerably? Which brings me to our last point here. Climbing the tree is not enough. We've got to come down. And to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus goes up the tree, allows himself in this moment of vulnerability to be seen, and Jesus sees him. And Jesus looks up and says, Zacchaeus, I see you. Now come down quickly. For today I must stay in your house. I want to come in. I want to meet you, and that's what heals. It's the love that heals. It's not being rejected when I share vulnerably. But I'm met with empathy. And Jesus from the beginning is pursuing Zacchaeus to meet him in this town, to see him up in the tree, to call him back home. Jesus never doesn't say, come on down now and let me in. He always says it. And in fact, as some church fathers have said, as Zacchaeus is short in stature, he's been compressed by sin. We've all been compressed by sin. And therefore, there is no tree whatsoever that's big enough or tall enough for us to climb up to that we can be shown, that God can see us. So what happens is that Jesus climbs up a tree himself so that we can run to that tree. We can share vulnerably with him. And so for us this morning to come down, some of us coming down from the tree this morning is going to be like Zacchaeus. It's going to be a radical change of our lives. This conversion of coming down, hearing the call of the one who pursues. And some of us, that calling down, it might be more of a reset. Like, I don't know if I've ever had that personal encounter with him. Or maybe I've lost it, or I've slipped into that gradual slope down as Pope Benedict is talking about. And I'm maybe living in that emotional isolation. That's why we run things like Rescue Project here, which we're going to be starting up in January. For 8 weeks, it's a dinner, it's a movie, and it's a discussion. To sign up for the Rescue Project, we do things like that to foster an encounter with him. To sign up for that. But you don't have to wait for that. Because today, as in every day, with the Mass, with the Eucharist, we have an opportunity to encounter him in a life-changing way. So for us to come up today, maybe for communion differently, coming up with a mindset like that, I'm up in the tree. I'm coming up to exposing myself to the Lord, to share vulnerably, because he never doesn't say, come on down now and be with me. Because as the end of the gospel says, he goes to seek out the lost, to come in, to be home. So do we have the guts to climb up the tree and to share vulnerably with the one who wants to encounter us?